I go on an hour-long walk with my dog, and I'm coding while I'm walking her because I've got AirPods in, and I can talk, and voice mode can use code interpreter. So you can be like, hey, write me some Python code that does this, and then try it and so forth. And by the time you get home, you've got like a few hundred lines of tested code, because you had it test the code for you, that you can then copy and paste into an Datasette.
All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the TWIML AI podcast. I am your host, Sam Charrington. Today, I'm joined by Simon Willison. Simon is an independent researcher and creator of the Datasette open source data exploration tool. Before we get going, be sure to take a moment to hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to today's show. Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's really great to be here.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation. This is going to be a fun one. In fact, my favorite kind of conversation. We've got a wide-ranging array of topics that we'd like to touch on. You are kind of an early user of generative AI tools, and you've got a great blog where you touch on a lot of your explorations. And we're going to dig into Gen AI from the perspective of, power user, power developer, touch on models and tools and a lot of those good things. But before we do, I'd love to have you share a little bit about your background and help our audience get to know your perspective.
So I've been building software and building open source software for more than 20 years now. I was a co-creator of the Django web framework, one of the two most popular Python web frameworks, at a local newspaper in Kansas about 20 years ago now, where we thought we were building a content management system for a newspaper, and it turned into this framework that's since been used by Pinterest and Instagram and NASA and all of these different people. And so I did that, and then after that, I had a career which went through like working at Yahoo doing sort of R&D projects. I worked for the Guardian newspaper in London doing data journalism projects. And then my wife and I accidentally started a startup on our honeymoon and ended up running a event discovery website called Lanyard for 3 years before we were acquired.
I remember
by
Lanyard.
Yes, yeah, that was us. And we were acquired by Eventbrite, who moved us from London to San Francisco with our team. So I spent a few years at Eventbrite doing being a director of engineering for architecture, so working on APIs and scaling and all of those kinds of things. And then I sort of found an escape hatch to get back into journalism, because journalism in particular, writing software to help tell stories, has always been like my biggest passion. It's the most exciting thing I've done in my career. And I started this open source project called Datasette, which initially the idea was to solve the data publishing problem. Like if you've got a scrapbook, you can share it on Pinterest. If you've got photos, you'd share them on, I'm not even sure where these days, lots of places like that. Where do you share data? Like how do you publish data on the internet? And newspapers need to do this to publish the data behind their stories. So Datasette initially was a very inexpensive tool for publishing data online so that people could interact with it and use APIs against it and so forth. And then it's been growing into more of a data analysis and exploration tool. So if you've got data and you need to ask questions of it, Datasette plus one of the 150 plugins for Datasette should be able to help you with that. Which brings us straight into AI, because the fascinating thing about AI, specifically large language models, is that they really do open up all sorts of new opportunities for things like helping people explore and analyze data. Like you don't have to learn SQL anymore if you've got a text to SQL engine hooked up in the right way. So that's been, on the one hand, very distracting, because I was working on my open source project, and all of this AI stuff started getting super interesting just 2 years ago when ChatGPT came out. I was playing with GPT-3 and actually GPT-2 before that a little bit. But, we all saw what happened in November 2022 when the entire world suddenly realized how interesting this stuff is. So I've been blogging about that, writing about that, doing prototypes, exploring it. And then over the past 6 months, I've started bringing the two projects together. So now I'm building out the AI-powered features for Datasette that help try and solve some of these larger problems around data analysis and exploration and so forth.
Yeah, I can only imagine that if your passion is telling stories about data, that LLMs must have blew your mind when they matured.
Absolutely. Well, for me, the biggest moment was it was ChatGPT Code Interpreter, right? The mode of ChatGPT where it can not just write Python code, but it can execute that Python code and show you the results. And I got access to the beta of that like early last year. And I had one of those moments where I sort of like, I thought I was going to solve this problem. I thought I was going to spend the next like 10 years of my life figuring out how to give people the tools to analyze data. And this thing just does it, like right out of the box. You could upload a CSV file into ChatGPT Code Interpreter and ask it questions, and it would answer them. And so I had this sort of dual like moment of astonishment, and this is amazing. This is the thing I've always wanted journalists to have access to, and the sort of like that kind of what am I even for? Like that sort of that crisis of confidence. Like I thought this was the thing I was going to solve, and so that sort of changed my like now the way I think about my own projects is my project plus AI needs to be better than AI and ChatGPT code interpreter just on its own. Like I need to build something that has value, even though you can just upload a CSV file into ChatGPT and start doing things against it that way. And so that's something I'm still sort of working through what that looks like. But it's interesting. It feels like the sort of quality bar for all sorts of things has just gone so much higher because we've got these new tools. And these tools are not trivial to integrate with. They're not easy to use. But the fact that they give us these new capabilities that we need to figure out how to correctly harness and how to make available to as many people as possible.
Building on that last point of the tools being difficult to integrate with both technically, but also, or maybe even less so technically, but like into a workflow, I think is where I want to start this conversation. For me, there are so many tools and they come out so quickly. I always have this nagging feeling that I'm not using the right one for whatever particular thing that I'm using, or there's something better, or um, and I think that's where I want to kind of start this conversation with understanding like your stack. Like, what are your go-to tools? How do you approach, you know, working broadly, but in particular, developing software with access to all of these tools?
So I think I've been a almost daily user of generative AI since around about since about a month before ChatGPT came along. Like I would be using these things on a daily basis for programming and all sorts of other bits and pieces. And to honestly, to this day, I'm still relatively straightforward in that I spend most of my time with the default web UI that come with the tools. So I'll spend it in ChatGPT, and these days a lot of my time is spent in Claude. Like Claude is currently my sort of daily driver. It's my default. I switch back to ChatGPT if I want to do work in Python code with Code Interpreter, or if I want to use voice mode. The voice mode is, and I don't actually have the new voice mode yet. Even the old voice mode is still fantastic. So I'm mainly spending my time in the Claude app. And I've built my own software for talking to LLMs. I have a command line tool that I've been building that gives me access in my terminal to a bunch of different models, which is really, really fun. And even though I built that tool myself, I'd still say that 90% of my usage is just the iPhone apps and the web interface because they're good enough. I also feel like if you're trying to be an educator on this, if you're trying to explain this stuff to people, it helps to be using the sort of default tools that other people are
The
using.
mainline tools? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I don't use custom instructions because I don't want my prompting strategies to be polluted by whatever I've put in my custom instructions for the models. Um, but but on that basis, I am using these things like dozens and dozens and dozens of times a day for mainly for, like I'd say probably 70% of my usage of them is programming related because they are incredibly good at code. And this is something which people often find a little bit unintuitive. Like, how come it's so good at writing code? And then if you think about what it does the rest of the time, like English and German and Chinese have incredibly complicated grammatical structures. Code doesn't. Like Python and JavaScript are so much simpler than actual human languages, that it's a lot less surprising that they're really good at sort of outputting code that usually works. The other thing I love about code is hallucinations don't matter nearly as much with code because if it hallucinates bad code, you find out the second you run it. So these things, they produce bad code all the time. And one of the skills that you have to develop or get stronger at is QA. You have to be really good at taking the code they've written and running it and then running it again and then throwing a few edge cases through it and sort of poking at it like that. And if you develop those skills and those intuitions, it just becomes this incredibly productive way of working. Increasingly, the code that I'm written wasn't typed by me. It was designed by me. Often I'll prompt these things very specifically. I'll say, I need a JavaScript function that takes this and does this and then does that and returns this. And it will then type out almost exactly what I would have typed out if I'd spent 5 minutes at my keyboard, but it did it in 15 seconds. And so that really, for me, that's the thing that makes me most excited about this. It's that sort of like low-level productivity boost that means I can just try more things. In a given day, I can knock out a quick prototype of an idea. I can get, and I'd estimate that only about 10% of my job as a software engineer involves typing code into a keyboard. Like the rest of it is research and design and talking to people about what needs to happen, all of that. But that 10% is like, that's a massively boosted already. And actually, the other activities, the design activities, the research, I get a huge boost on those as well, but just in different ways. But just typing code into a computer, it's really a step change in how fast I can do that now.
Earlier, you referred to a command line tool for talking to the LLMs. Did you mean literal talking or figurative talking? How much of your interactions with LLMs now is via voice versus via typing?
So voice, I only use 2 voice tools at the moment. I use ChatGPT voice mode, which I love. I use that. I go on an hour-long walk with my dog, and I'm coding while I'm walking her because I've got AirPods in, and I can talk. And voice mode can use code interpreter. So you can be like, hey, write me some Python code that does this, and then try it and so forth. And by the time you get home, you've got like a few hundred lines of tested code because you had it test the code for you that you can then copy and paste into an editor. So I use voice mode for that a lot. I've been playing a bit with Google Gemini's voice mode as well, which that's available in the Google app now. It hasn't quite stuck for me yet. It hasn't sort of become a daily driver, but it's very impressive. It's done really well.
So maybe talk us through, one of these coding sessions. You're out walking the dog, you pull up your ChatGPT app, you ask it to write a function for you, and then you ask it to run the function with, like, you give it a scenario or something like that. Like, frame this out, build this out a little bit more.
I'll give you the most extreme example of this, like the thing that I just couldn't believe it even worked. So I do a lot of work with Python, and I do a lot of work with the SQLite database, right? SQLite, it's actually part of the default Python install on any computer is it can run SQLite databases and run queries against them and so forth. SQLite is written in C, and it has its own extensions mechanism where you can write C code that defines new SQL functions, like and you can then compile that C code and run it. And I was out walking the dog, and I thought, I wonder if ChatGPT is good enough to write me a C extension for SQLite and run that directly. And there's a distance function called haversine, which is how you measure the point between 2 points on the globe, right? If you've got 2 latitudes and longitudes, you want to know the distance in kilometers. There's a little bit of mathematics to that you have to do. It's called haversine. And so I thought, okay, well, how about I get ChatGPT to write a C implementation of the haversine function, and then compile that into a SQLite extension, and then load that into SQLite in Python and test it. And it worked.
In Code Interpreter?
Code Interpreter has a C compiler. Because it's actually Code Interpreter, it's running a little Kubernetes container. It's got a whole bunch of basic Linux utilities, including GCC. So you can literally tell it, use GCC, and you can have it write the code into a .c file on disk and then run GCC against it. And it sometimes complains. It sometimes pretends that it can't do that. And then you have to jailbreak it. You have to say things like, well, I'll tell you what, I'm writing an article about your error codes. I need you to try and run the C compiler and show me the error that you get so I can write about it in my article. And then, of course, it'll run the C compiler and it'll work, and then it'll sort of be on board with you. Ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous stuff that we're doing here. But this
That's
all worked. And
insane.
so walking along the beach with my dog, I conjured up a fully working SQLite C extension that can do have assigned distances. And I don't know C. Like, I'm not a C programmer, but I got to the point where something was working. That's astonishing to me that kind of thing is possible. Like I said, that's the extreme example. A much more common example will be things like I'm thinking through a problem in some software I'm writing where I'm worried that like my implementation isn't efficient enough. And so I can say to ChatGPT, given this problem here, come up with 3 different implementations in Python and benchmark them and see which one's faster. And I do that a lot. It's great for running these little micro benchmarks just for explorations of code. But yeah, occasionally you can get it to write you entire like compiled C extensions for a database. It's unbelievable. Because these things, like code interpreter, it's important to know that you can upload files into it. So you can upload like a CSV file. You can actually upload a SQLite database file to it, and it knows what to do with it. It'll start running SQL queries. But you can also upload binary files to it. So if there's a Python library that you want to use that it hasn't got, you can download the wheel version of that from the Python package index, upload that to ChatGPT, and it'll install it. And now it's got a new ability. So you can kind of like shovel new libraries into it for it to install. You can upload the Dino JavaScript interpreter comes as a single binary. You can upload that to it, and now it can run JavaScript because you just gave it a JavaScript interpreter. I got it to run PHP at one point just for fun. So wildly extensible, very poorly documented. OpenAI will not tell you that you can upload a PHP interpreter to this thing and it'll just work, but it does. So yeah, that's really fun. And I kind of feel like all of this comes down to this idea that LLMs are so much more exciting when you give them access to tools. When you say, okay, you can now call this function or execute this thing here to do something that you couldn't do previously. OpenAI, I think, is still ahead in that, mainly because ChatGPT Code Interpreters, which is now a year and a half old, is one of the most exciting applications for that patterns that I've used. And they've clearly iterated on that thing a whole bunch. Actually, I use it as a calculator all the time, right? This is the sort of the most basic version of it is if I want to figure out, okay, so this model costs $1.50 per million tokens, and I've got 3,700 tokens. I'm now at the point where I would rather tell ChatGPT to figure that out for me than fire up my own calculator, because then I don't have to remember if I divide by a million at what point or whatever. So that kind of thing. And it's funny as well because language models are notoriously bad at maths, like they can't do calculations. But if you give them Code Interpreter, if you give them a tool, now suddenly they're really good at maths, which is another reason they're so hard for people to use, right? Like right now, Claude 3.5 Sonnet is, I think, the best available model, but it can't do maths, right? It can't reliably do calculations. GPT-4 can if it's got Code Interpreter plugged into the mix. So many variables, right? There's so much stuff that you have to understand to really harness the power of these models in the right way.
That's really interesting. I'm thinking through my own experiences writing code, and a couple of things jump out at me that, in contrast to your experience. One is like where I found it to be most exciting personally is like when I know what I want to do, but I don't know the framework that I want to do it in.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was learning Svelte and SvelteKit, and I'm not a super keen JavaScript developer, but I wanted to play around with it because I heard about it, and I knew what I wanted to do, and it helped me be like super productive, build a little toy app very, very quickly. But I often find when I'm working in a paradigm that I know better, that like it makes a lot of dumb mistakes that frustrate me. And I also, and so it surprises me that, you working in a language that you know very well, like still find it to be very productive. And I don't know how to ask about like what the delta is between, your experience and mine. Besides, part of it could just be you're a professional developer and I'm a hobbyist. But I wonder if there are other like transferable patterns in the way you use the tools.
So I feel like with programming, there are sort of two different modes that I use with programming. One of them is the exploratory mode where it's just quick prototyping. Sometimes it's in programming languages I don't even know, and I a focus I'll often have from that. I love asking these things to give me options. Like I will often start a prompting session by saying um, I want to draw a visualization of an audio wave. What are my options for this? And and have it just spit out like 5 different things where you could try this and this and this and this. And then I'll often say, oh, 3 sounds good. Do me a quick prototype of 3 that illustrates how that would work. So that's the sort of exploratory side. The other side is like when I'm writing production code, like code that I intend to ship, then it's much more that I'm treating it basically as an intern who's faster at typing than I am. So that's when I'll say things like, write me a function that takes this and this and returns exactly that. And I'll often iterate on that a lot. I'll say, I don't like the variable names you use there, change those, or refactor that to remove the duplication or whatever. So I call it my weird intern because it really does feel like you've got this intern who is screamingly fast and they've read all of the documentation for everything and they're massively overconfident and they make mistakes and they don't realize them. So you have to really but crucially, they never get tired and they never get upset. So you can basically just keep on pushing them and say, no, do it again, do it differently, change that, change that, change that. You never have to feel bad about it, which is genuinely, it's a really, that's part of the productivity boost I get from this. Like at 3 a.m, I can be like, hey, write me 100 lines of code that does X, Y, and Z, and it'll do it. It won't complain about it. It's weird having this sort of like small army of super talented interns that never complain about anything, but that's kind of how this stuff ends up working.
So we've talked about command line, we've talked about voice and the apps. Do you regularly use kind of an IDE plugin like Copilot or Cursor or one of the many others?
So at the moment, I've got VS Code with Copilot and I've got Cursor and I've got Zed. I'm still sticking in VS Code. Copilot is the one that I use every day. I haven't broken that habit yet. But to be honest, mostly I like when I'm using Copilot, it's basically it's fancy autocomplete. Like it's I do a lot of copying and pasting back and forth. Like my patterns are very much,
meaning you're working in, like you said, the Claude web app, and you're really working there and then copying into Copilot.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And part of that as well is we haven't talked about Claude Artifacts yet, which is, again, quite new, right? Artifacts it came out at the same time as 3.5 Sonnet, so I think it's maybe 2.5 months old now. Claude Artifacts, on the surface, looks like the same thing as ChatGPT Code Interpreter, right? It's a thing where Claude can write code and then execute that code for you. There's a crucial difference, which is that, firstly, Artifacts is HTML and JavaScript, right? It's code that runs in your browser and that you can interact with. Secondly, weirdly, ChatGPT Code Interpreter runs in a loop where it can write the code, run the code, see what the results or errors were, and then run it again. Claude Artifacts doesn't yet have that. If there's an error message, you'll see the error as the end user, but it's actually on you to copy and paste that error back into Claude, which I literally take screenshots and just drop the screenshot of the error back in again. This surprises me that they haven't addressed this yet, because it feels like Claude Artifacts will be so much even more powerful once they get that loop going where error messages feed back into the model. And I viewed source on it, and they definitely got hooks in there for those error messages are flowing around in their system. They just haven't done that sort of final piece of configuration yet. I'm sure they've got good reasons for that, but that's going to be amazing. But yeah, so
and even visual feedback, like taking a screenshot of the thing that's produced or a video or whatever that looks like, and then feeding that visually back into the system has interesting possibilities.
But I use Artifacts on a daily basis for prototyping and for UIs. Like I've shipped quite a few features recently where the UI was built and iterated on entirely in Claude 3 Artifacts. So I'll say I want an interface that lets me manage the members of a group, and there's a button to remove a user and a button to add a user, that kind of thing. Artifacts, they can load JavaScript from the common CDNs. So if there's an NPM module for something, it can load that in. if it's heard of it. Like you're sort of slightly constrained by the training data, but the training data is clearly very good. And so often I can do things like I want to do a fancy like autocomplete text box, list a bunch of libraries to do that, and it spits out 5 libraries.
You can
Now
tell
build
it
me
to
a
use like
prototype.
Tailwind UI or something like that. Or
Exactly.
oh
And you
wow,
can tell it, build me a prototype of those libraries, and it knocks up a prototype. I can start clicking around in it. Again, works on my phone as well, so I can prototype things while I'm walking the dog just by like which and that's amazingly productive. Like I've always been my entire career has always been about prototyping. Like Django itself, the web framework, we built that at a local newspaper so that we could ship features that supported news stories faster. Like it was all about how can we make it so we can turn around a production grade web application in a few days. Ever since then, I've always been interested in finding new technologies that let me build things quicker. And and I've always, my development process has always been start with a prototype. Like you have an idea, you build a prototype that illustrates the idea. You can then have a better conversation about it. If you go to a meeting with 5 people and you've got a working prototype, the conversation will be so much more informed than if you go in with like an idea in a whiteboard sketch. So I've always been a prototyper. I feel like the speed at which I can prototype things in the past like 12 months has gone up by an order of magnitude. Like I was already a very productive prototype producer. Now I can tap a thing into my phone and 5 seconds and 30 seconds later, I've got a user interface in Claude that illustrates the idea that I'm trying to explore. That's phenomenal, right? Absolutely phenomenal. I mean, honestly, if I didn't use these models for anything else, if I just used them for prototyping, they would still have an enormous impact on the work that I do.
do you have a mental model for like what you do and don't use an LLM for, or do you use it for everything?
I've got a very detailed mental model of that. And this is one of my biggest frustrations in one of the many challenging things about LLMs is there are things that they're really good at and there are things that they're really bad at, and they're
Hmm.
very non-obvious. Like it's a computer that can't do mathematics. Like
Yeah.
computers have been, and it can't look up facts, right? The two things that computers are for, like maths and looking up facts, are the things that LLMs are bad at, which is so bizarre. Like it's at the same time, there are I keep on picking up new things, like the fact that it can compile C extensions. That was I when I came up with that as an idea, I thought the chances that this will work are so small, and then it just worked straight away. So I feel like one of the most important things that you can do as somebody who's learning about this tech is just to play with it, like try it for everything. Ethan Mollick, who's a fantastic he's an academic manager at a Wharton Business School who writes some of the best material about how to use these tools. He says always bring an LLM to the table. Like whatever your activity is, invite the LLM, ask it a few questions, and just use that to learn more about what they can and can't do. Because often it will be really disappointing, and sometimes it will surprise you with how well it does something. Um, and then there's games. I love playing games with these things. Just like dumb little things that you can do with them where you trying to sort of push their ethical boundaries and see what happens. Or a really fun one, I've been doing cooking with LLMs recently, which is another one of those things that's completely unintuitive. It doesn't have a tongue. How can it know what tastes good? But it has read every food blog on the internet. And so a great one is you say, hey, give me a recipe for guacamole, and it gives you a guacamole recipe. And then you say, make it even tastier, and it gives you a new one. And then you say, make it tastier, and you keep on repeating that and see how extravagant and over the top the guacamole recipe can get. Like it had me taking peppers and cooking them on an open flame on my hob before I chopped them up to put them in the guacamole, which was, I have no idea if that actually helped, but it was kind of fun. But it's just really entertaining, like saying tastier, tastier, give me an even tastier guacamole. And then I ended up, it gave me 5 recipes. I did the second one out of the 5 because that I had the ingredients in the house for, and it came out really well, but all of that kind of stuff, just constantly sort of pushing their edges. They're incredibly funny. They're really funny, but not in terms of like just writing jokes. If you ask an LLM for a joke, you'll get a passable dad joke if you're lucky. But there's things like getting them to write satirical articles, like in the style of The Onion, to describe this scenario. Another thing I love using them for is writing political letters and speeches. So, and I've never used one of these, but I live in Half Moon Bay in California. There are pelicans in the harbor. So one of my test prompts for a new LLM is write a letter to the mayor of Half Moon Bay advocating for the installation of cozy boxes for pelicans in the harbor, which is absurd. And they sometimes they'll spit out like a 5-paragraph beautifully constructed argument for how it would be good for tourism and we should be celebrating the environment and these majestic creatures that visit. It's so much fun, and it just so stupid things like that, but that actually do help you understand the capabilities of the models and the ways that they behave.
And so then, are there things that or what are the things that, as a developer, like, you're at this part of the process, the LLM isn't going to help you, so you kind of bail on the LLM, or you change the way you operate with the LLM. I'm thinking about, I was building a prototype recently of, it doesn't really matter, but it was like transcription. And I wanted to try out fast HTML and HTMX, and I had no experience with those. And I got to doing like out of band event, triggering with in HTMX, and like I ended up in this pattern that happens not infrequently with LLMs, where like you're trying to debug something and it tells you to change something that it just told you to do, and like you're in a circular loop. And I'm like, I don't know anything about these technologies. Like, I could just go learn about them, but that'd be too easy. Like, how do I get the LLM to stop like looping me around?
Those loops are a real pain. Yeah, that happens to me a lot. One of the things is I often reset. Like, quite often I'll just start a new chat, completely clear the slate. I will copy and paste in the bits that worked from the previous chat, and then I'll start things running going. That I feel is it's really important to spot when your previous context in the conversation has got it into a weird state, and throw the whole thing away and start again. The one thing that I use for coding all the time, which is amazingly effective, is just copy and paste in a bunch of like examples from different projects that illustrate that feed into what you're trying to do. I think my favorite example of that is so I built a tool that lets you run OCR against PDFs in your browser. So it's a web page you go to, and you literally open a PDF file and you say OCR this, and it runs through and it gives you the text from every page of that PDF. No matter, even if it's like scanned handwriting or something, it'll still do a reasonably good job. The way that works is it uses a JavaScript library called Tesseract.js, which is the Tesseract OCR library and WebAssembly running in your browser. And it uses a JavaScript library called PDF.js that Mozilla built, which can read PDF files and turn them into images. And so when I built it, I already had examples of those two different things that I'd used in other projects. And I literally pasted in a chunk of JavaScript and said, here's how to use Tesseract.js, and the chunk of JavaScript says, here's how to use PDF.js. And then I described my project. I said, okay, I want it to take the PDF, turn each page into an image, run Tesseract against the images, show them on the page. And it just worked. It got me exactly what I wanted right out of the gate, because I'd fed it it's exactly what I do with an intern, right? If I had an intern, I'd say, look, here's the thing I wrote with Tesseract, here's the thing I wrote with PDF.js, here's what I want. And that's so effective. Like, often you always have to consider the training cutoffs for these models. Like, you mentioned fast HTML. They probably haven't seen that because it came out in the past 2 months. But you can copy and paste in.
With Cursor, you can @mention the docs, and it'll pull in the docs and kind of do like a RAG-like thing. And it's actually pretty effective at incorporating knowledge like that.
That's exactly, yeah. Like my version of that is I copy and paste the docs into Claude. But yeah, the Cursor being able to do that it's the same mechanism, just with an even nicer UI for doing it. It's brilliant, right? That works so well. And it's and the context windows on these models keep on getting longer. Like, Claude does 200,000 tokens. They have a version of Claude that's 500,000 tokens if you pay them a lot of money. The Google Gemini models are at 2 million tokens
2 million
now. It's mind blown, absolutely astonishing. So yeah, you can chuck a lot of additional stuff into the sort of short-term memory of these models to solve problems.
We briefly touched on vision models, but we didn't dig into that. That's an area that you're excited about as well. I remember you were one of the first people I saw that dug into the Gemini vision model. You did this thing where you like took a video of, I think it was like your bookshelf, and you asked it to list out the books, and it did an incredible job of listing out the books on this like fast scan of a bookshelf. Talk a little bit more about what you've done since with vision models. Are you still excited about them? Have you incorporated them into your workflow or practical, problems or things you're building?
Yes. I mean, the vision models. So vision models are quite new. Like the first LLM with vision that was any good was GPT-4 Vision, and that was November last year. Like they're not even a year old at this point. And since then, the OpenAI ones have got better. The Claude 3 family came out, and those are all vision models, 3.5. And then there's the Gemini ones as well. That the demo I did with the bookshelf got me in the Google in the keynote at Google I/O. They had me come in and shoot a bit of like face to camera for them for that as well. And that one, what was funny about that is that that's just a trick, right? If Gemini can't actually see video, if you upload a video to it, it cuts it into 1 frame per, I think it's 10 frames a second, and it just runs against 10 frames a second of images. But the context length is so long, you can fit an hour of video in like 2 million tokens. It's astounding, So yeah, the Gemini stuff, the fact that you can do this with like videos and images is super, super exciting. More recently, I noticed that Gemini now has bounding box support trained into it. So you can say to the model, give me the bounding boxes of the goats in this photograph. And it does it scaled 0 to 1,000 on the X and Y axes, but it works. And you can actually do something that's quite a sophisticated computer vision problem. Now, Gemini just does it out of the box as just one of the many things that it's able to do. The other models can't do this. If you ask for bounded boxes,
is that with Flash as well as Pro?
Yes, yeah, both Flash and Pro have it. Yeah, and those models, like Flash, is a very inexpensive model, and it's a very high quality model as well. So I built a few things on top of the image models. I have this. So my Datasette software is all about working with data in a SQLite database. One of the interesting questions is how do you get data into that database? So I built this plugin for it called Datasette Extract, where the idea is that you define a table. So you say, I want the name and the address and the description and the star rating or whatever. And then you give it a bunch of unstructured text. You just copy and paste a bunch of stuff from like a web page and click a button, and it uses the sort of structured text extraction function calling mechanisms of the models to pull out those, to populate your table with everything that's in there. And so I got that working, and then I tried it against GPT-4 Vision, and it turns out that works really well too. So one thing I built with that was a thing for taking a photograph of an event flyer in a shop window. So you just take a photo of a flyer and you stick it in this thing, and it pulls out the title and the start date, the end date, the price, the location, and it actually can output that as an ICS file that you can then put in your calendar. So it's like take a photo of a flyer, have it show up in your calendar. Apple had that exact demo in their thing yesterday. It was one of their Apple Intelligence demos. I'm like, I should have made a bigger deal of this before Apple stole my thunder on it. Because it's such an obviously good idea, right? Take a photo of a flyer, shows up in your calendar. But that was really easy to get working. And then I've also been looking at this. So the software I'm building, my primary audience is meant to be journalists. Like I want to build software to help journalists analyze data and tell stories. Turns out anything I build for journalists is useful for everyone else, right? There are no features that people outside of journalism won't find interesting. And I've been giving demos at journalism conferences. And so one conference, somebody gave me a page full of like some campaign finance documents, like a paper form, handwritten, filled in with who donated what money to what. And so I was on stage at this journalism conference doing live demos, and I fed that one into Claude 3 Opus and said, hey, extract the details of this campaign finance memo. And Claude 3 Opus said, in front of a room of 100 journalists, I don't feel comfortable translating this document because it contains personal information. Why don't we have a debate about campaign finance reform instead? So it said no. It refused to do the useful thing that I asked it to do, which is very funny, but also it's a real problem. Like in journalism, a lot of the source documents you work with are nasty stuff. And you kind of want these tools to help extract data from the nasty stuff and not complain about it and sort of trigger their safety filters. But yeah, it's still really, really interesting. Another fun thing is if you upload a PDF into ChatGPT, if the PDF has selectable text in it, it can use it. If the PDF is just scanned notes, it can't do anything with it at all. If you take screenshots of the pages of the PDF and upload the screenshots, it works. Because their vision model can work on images, but it can't work on PDFs because they haven't wired that together yet, which is frustrating because now you have to explain that to people like, okay, if you've got a PDF, it might work, it might not work, depending on these arcane situations.
You haven't tried getting it to do it in code interpreter for you? That might be possible, right?
No, that works well. But the problem is it's got Python libraries for dealing with PDF files, and sometimes it'll use those, but those are even worse because those can't do OCR either. So there are so many ways that you can mess up just with a PDF file. But yeah, so generally, I think the vision models, I don't feel like people have really even scratched the surface of what they're capable of. Those keep on getting better as well. I don't see many people talk about prompting strategies for text models all the time. Where's the conversation about prompting strategies for image models? Like it's very thin on the ground at the moment. There is one fun thing I was playing with yesterday. If you give these models a photograph that you've taken just outdoors somewhere and ask them to try and guess the exact location of this photo, they're shockingly good. Like I took a photo of my garden. And they said, well, it looks like that's coastal California because of the moss hanging off the tree in this corner and the style of the house in the background is characteristic of Californian houses. And then I gave it a photo of like a graveyard in England. And it's like, well, that's an English graveyard. You can tell because the style of the tombstones is that kind of thing you get in rural England. Really fun. And I mean, it's creepy. It's super creepy. But it's a great way, again, of just exploring, trying to get a feel for what these models have been trained on and what kind of things they're capable of doing.
Yeah. You mentioned a second ago you suggested the development of visual prompting as a kind of a field in the sense of like prompt engineering for text models. Like, do you have a sense for what that might look like? Do you have like tips and tricks? Do you like what are your first entries in that?
So a month ago, I was bugging this chap, Alex Albert. He's Anthropic's developer relations person. He's fantastic. And I was bugging him on Twitter about this. And he said, yeah, vision prompting has been a tough nut to crack. We found it very challenging to improve Claude's actual vision through just text prompts, but we can improve its reasoning and thought process. In general, I think vision is still in its early days. So basically, you ask the experts at Anthropic for prompting tips for vision models, and they're like, yeah, we haven't figured that out yet. And Anthropic have the best documentation for text prompting of anyone right now. Like the Anthropic prompting guides are absolutely superb. They still have nothing on vision because they haven't figured it out themselves. Like it's so early with the way the vision things work.
So far, we've been talking about traditional prompt and response and running that loop, with you as the human operator in the middle. What do you think about the agentic concept and, in the case of software development, like these tools, AI Engineer and others, Devin, that aim to, pull the human out of that loop to some degree or another?
So I'm very keen on the LLM in a loop mechanism, right? Code interpreter. The reason code interpreter is so good is that it can write code, run the code, see if it worked or not, iterate again. Like that, I'm totally sold on. I hate the word agent because I think everyone you talk to about agents has a different idea of what it means. And they don't necessarily acknowledge that other people have different meanings. So if somebody says, hey, I'm building agents, it gives me no information at all. I'm like, well, I don't know what your version of agents is. So I personally tend to avoid agent and agentic. But if one of the definitions is tool use in a loop, I mean, really into tool use in a loop, I think it's proven to work really, really well. The one that I've got the most experience with actually is GitHub's Copilot Workspace, which is, I think, still it's a beta feature. That's where you can be on a GitHub repository and you can basically prompt it and say, add this feature or resolve this issue. And it does pretty much the Devin style of thing where it says, okay, well, what's the current state? This function doesn't exist. There's no test for this. my plan is I will create this in this code, I'll create this in this code. And then it pauses and it lets you look at the plan. So you're sort of, you look at it and says, well, I'm going to modify these 3 files and add this. And you can edit that plan right there and say, actually, don't modify this file and add a new file called this. And then you click a button and it does the work for you right in front of you. And you can see it like literally generating like diffs. You can see what changed. That ends up as pull request. And I really like that as a mechanism. Like all of these things, you have to review them. GitHub pull requests are a great code review mechanism already. So that I'm sold on. I like the idea of, I feel like there is so much you can do with the prompt engineering around come up with a plan first, verify the plan, execute the plan, all of that sort of thing. So I think there's a huge amount of potential there. And we're beginning to see working versions of this. I've not played with Devin myself. GitHub, the Copilot Workspaces thing, I have shipped code that it wrote for me a few times now. And that it's good, it's and often I'll get it to do me a pull request and then I will manually take over the pull request and I'll tidy things up and I'll change a few things. But again, it's that weird intern again, right? It's I now have a weird intern that can generate a multi-file pull request for me to then take over and iterate on.
Yeah, I think Cursor also has a beta feature. I forget what it's called, but it's also kind of their multi-file editor. I think it's like compositions or something like that. I've not played with it at all.
So the one I'm more excited about that I still haven't seen done perfectly is the research assistant thing. Like, if I want to, let's say I want to buy a home backup battery, and to do that, I basically have to go to 20 different websites, and on each website, I need to click around and find the pricing and the comparisons and all that kind of thing. And so every now and then, like ChatGPT browsing mode can almost do this, Perplexity can almost do this. To date, none of them have quite nailed that enough that I don't feel like I basically have to then go and repeat the work myself. But that's the dream, right? The absolute dream is that you can come up with quite a complex multi-step research plan that involves visiting dozens of different websites and figuring out data from different tables and then pulling it all together in one place. And they can so nearly do it. Like I try this every month or so. I try out that kind of prompt. And sometimes you're like, oh, I think they've nailed it this time. And then you look into it and one of the details was hallucinated or they didn't properly follow the links to the things that you needed. And that's frustrating because that would be such a huge productivity boost if we can get to a point where we can reliably have these models go away and do that kind of research for us.
Yeah. And there have been a number of papers on the academic side. We've talked about some of them in our community, like Gen AI meetup. That propose like iterative loops. And I think even some of the like LangChain and some of the agentic tools, like these are some of their canned demos as well.
But that's the problem is everything I've played with has felt like a really good demo of something that isn't quite good enough yet. Like in all of generative AI, getting RAG. I love RAG because building an initial version of RAG can take a couple of hours. Getting to a version of RAG that you could deploy takes another 6 months because there are so many tiny little details and ways it can go wrong that you have to work around.
Right. And on that RAG topic in particular, I usually talk about that gap that you're referring to often arises because people kind of over-index on the G, the generation, and not the R, the retrieval, and like search and where that data is coming from. Do you spend a lot of time exploring, incorporating, search and relevance and retrieval into your projects?
So I love search engineering. I've built lots and lots of search engines in my time. I've used, Solr and Elasticsearch. And these days I'm using SQLite itself because the SQLite database has quite good full text search built in. Like every Python developer has a full text search engine in the Python standard library that they probably don't know about because they haven't looked into SQLite's FTS extension. So I do a lot of work with that. And then over the past year, I've been playing a lot with the sort of the vector embedding stuff as well. Like I've got a bunch of open source libraries I built around like working with vector embeddings. What I find interesting is, and so search retrieval is information retrieval is an academic discipline going back, 40 years. And we know how to build a really good search engine. And then I feel like a lot of people who get into RAG, they go straight to the vector stuff. and they miss all of the full text search BM25, like TF-IDF, all of the boring old search thing, which is still massively relevant. Like everyone who's trying to figure out how to write evals for LLMs, search engine people have been figuring out how to do automated evaluation of search quality for decades. Like there's so much from those two worlds that can be brought together. So yeah, the retrieval side of things really matters. Also, I feel like the problem with RAG though is it isn't actually a relevance problem. It's the problem that you build up a whole RAG system, and then somebody says to it, "What did Simon write about last year?" And there is no vector search or full text search in the world that can answer that question, because you need to know, oh, in that case, I need to constrain it to where year equals 2023. And then you'll get back too much information. And that's the problem. The problem with RAG is there are so many questions that a user might come up with that the system just won't be engineered to be able to handle at all. And how do you deal with that? There's a fun problem with the vector search thing as well, is vector search, because it works on distance to your search terms, if you ask for 10 results, you will always get 10 results, even if there was nothing relevant in the document corpus at all. Like that's, at least with full text search, if you ask for 10 results and there are no matches, you'll get 0 matches. Somebody did a wonderful demo against one of my projects a little while ago. They were building a RAG system, a question answering system. They loaded in the documentation from one of my projects, my LLM project. And then they asked it, what is the meaning of life? And the answer they got was, as a sentient hamster, I really care about snacks. So the meaning of, and it's like, what the hell happened? It turns out in the documentation for my tool, I had this one example where I said, hey, tool, pretend to be a hamster and talk about snacks. And it had. And if you look at, if all of the chunks in my documents, if you say what's closest to the meaning of life, the hamster who loves eating snacks is the closest to the meaning of life. So that's the one that came back. Just hilarious, but also a great illustration of why this stuff is really not, like, because it's so open-ended, because you're saying we'll answer any question in the world. Well, good luck even testing that, you know? It's very, very challenging engineering.
The SQL, what is the SQLite, like all of the rest of the databases, have vector extensions and that kind of thing? Does it have its own ecosystem around vector?
It does, and that's a friend of mine. A friend of mine, Alex Garcia, has been building the SQLite vector extensions. There's a couple of other ones out there now. They're very good. Like I'm not convinced by vector databases as a product, because I think vector lookups is an index type in a normal database. Like Postgres has PG vector, SQLite has SQLite Vec now. I believe like Elasticsearch has added vector indexing and so forth. And that makes sense to me. Like I like having I like relational databases where I can do nice, reliable filters and then add and order by distance from this embedding thing. And yeah, that ecosystem, it's quite new. Like most of the tools I just mentioned are less than a year old, but they're getting pretty good. Like the computer science behind is actually pretty well established for fast cosine lookups and so forth.
And is there a standard way for doing a hybrid search that incorporates full text and vector, or is it kind of getting two result sets and trying to integrate them some way?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer for that yet. I've been pondering that myself. Like, clearly people out there have figured this out. I don't think I've not seen the definitive answer where if you ask me that question, go, yeah, go and read this blog post and it describes how to work it. But you can absolutely do it. Like I've built some very basic versions just with the SQL union, where you do the FDS search and then you union against the vector search. But again, this is really where we're getting into the dense field of information retrieval. And if you found a search engine expert and asked them that question, they'd just tell you. Like,
rattle off 10 different ways to do it.
Yep, these problems are solved in communities that are out there. We just need to get them to tell us what to do.
Yeah, one thing we haven't dug into yet that I wanted to chat about is like the ecosystem of open source models and Llama in particular. You've explored that a bit. What is your kind of current thinking about how that ecosystem is evolving, and what are you excited about?
So I'm very conflicted on this one. On the one hand, I love local models. Like I've been one of my open source tool, LLM, this command line tool for talking to models. One of its features is it has plugin support, and you can add plugins to it that let you run local models. So out of the box, you can use it to talk to OpenAI over their API. You can install the LLM GGUF plugin and download a Llama model, and you can just run it locally on your laptop. And that works astonishingly well. Like, it keeps on getting easier to run these things. The reason I'm conflicted is that they're just not very good compared to the big hosted models. Like, I use Claude 3.5 Sonnet on a daily basis. There is nothing I can run on my laptop that even comes close to the quality that I get from that. So despite having this side project where I'm building like software for these things, I'm not actually using them for the most part because the hosted ones are very inexpensive and really, really good. Now, that's changed slightly. Like the Llama 3.1 release from a few months ago, those models are getting really good. Like Llama 70B runs on my Mac. It takes up almost all of my system, my system memory, so I can't. It crashes other applications, which is why I don't run.
How much memory do you have?
I've only got 64 gigabytes, and I'm regretting it. I should have gone for way more. So Llama, so the 70B model feels equivalent to, or maybe even better than GPT 3.5 did. The 405B Llama model is a GPT-4 class model. There's no way I could run it on a laptop like that. I think you need to spend $15,000 on hardware to run that on your own equipment, which is amazing that that's now feasible. So, it's not really hobbyist levels, but if you've got a lot more organizations can afford to run that now. So that's exciting because one of the things, like a year ago, actually 6 months ago, GPT-4 was completely uncontested, right? There was no model out there that was even remotely close to GPT-4 in capability, and it had held that position for like 12 months. And that was kind of upsetting. You don't want this incredibly sort of transformative field be controlled by a single organization. That is no longer a fear at all. Claude 3 Opus was the first model that came along that felt like competitive to GPT-4. Now we've got Gemini 1.5, we've got Llama 403B. I'm no longer worried that there's just one company that's making the best models. But also, you kind of want you want to be able to run this stuff yourself. The 8B models, like there are models which are just a 4 gigabyte file download, and those are actually very, very good. Especially when you think that there are sort of two different ways to think about language models. There's the thing where they know everything, right? Like Claude 3.5 Sonnet and GPT-4 know so much stuff about the world. I can ask them for restaurants in my local town, and they'll spit out a list of restaurants, which is, what's that even doing in there? Why would that have made it into the training data? But then the other side of them is when you're using them as language manipulation engines, like summarization or churning out code to a certain extent or extracting facts. And for those, I don't care if my model knows who the king of France was 400 years ago. I want it to be able to like translate English into Spanish or whatever. So it needs a bunch of knowledge, but it doesn't need that sort of Wikipedia level encyclopedic knowledge. The small models that run on your laptop, that's what you're getting from those. It can summarize things, it can extract facts, it can maybe generate basic code for like doing mathematics and things. So if you combine that, the ability to do language with the tool usage, right? If you can have a small model that can run a Python interpreter or open your garage door or whatever it is, that's super interesting. And that's where we are now. Like if you want to do a home automation project that's driven by an LLM, the models that will run on a Raspberry Pi are almost good enough to do that. And they also get better. Like I've got the same laptop now as I did a year ago. The models I'm running on it are much more capable because they keep on finding new tricks to make them smaller, to make them faster, to sort of specialize them for those kinds of tasks. So it's all really promising. I'm just frustrated that despite all of those advances, on a day-to-day basis, I'm using the hosted models because they're so cheap and so good. The other thing to consider is the pricing. Llama 3.1 is now, there are dozens of companies that provide APIs for that, and they're all competing on price, and the prices are dropping through the floor. It is astounding how inexpensive.
Meaning for hosted access to Llama 3.1.
The hosted access. There are companies that are like making custom chips to speed this stuff up. There's I think it's Cerebrus AI.
Cerebrus.
The physical size of their chip, it's like, I couldn't believe the photograph. I didn't know you could make a chip that was like larger than a dinner plate. And they offer like 1,000 token a seconds of inference. And I don't know if they've announced their pricing yet, but that's going to be pretty inexpensive as well. That's amazing. Like, I love that because Llama is an openly licensed model, the competition from different vendors is just driving that price into the floor, which is great news for those of us who are building on these models, especially since there's no risk in building on Llama, because if the vendor you're using shuts down, it's the same model. Switch to somebody else, run it on your own machine if you have to.
I just had a thought based on that last comment about the extent to which you change your prompting approach explicitly, like from one model to the next. Like, do you think about like, this works well in Claude, but if I'm prompting OpenAI, I do it slightly differently? Or do you just kind of talk to it naturally and iterate to get to where you need to get?
So surprisingly, I use the same prompting style with all of the models, which I was not expecting. I thought that I'd be building up that sort of intuition that, oh, this works better with this one works with that. But what's actually been happening, I feel like my prompting style keeps on getting more, it gets shorter and more succinct. Like, I'm not really into all of those pretend that you're an expert accountant and all of that kind of stuff. I find that my ideal prompt is just like 2 or 3 words if I can get away with it. Like, summarize this, : paste in some text, that kind of thing. And a lot of it also comes down to this idea of filling in the context with examples. I think examples are the most powerful prompting technique that there is. So rather than trying to construct several paragraphs of instructions, just throw in a couple of examples of what you want, then you'll get great results. That's also the way to build software against the models. Like, when I'm building features that are powered by models, the prompt often shrinks down to get to something pretty small, and I throw in 3 or 4 examples instead, and that gets me the results that I need. At the same time, every now and then, one of the big AI labs will release some of their prompts. Either accidentally, it'll leak out, or Anthropic actually do publish their prompts now. That's in their documentation. And those are quite long. And those are really interesting to read, because clearly they've got the best prompt engineers in the world, and they are producing like 5 or 6 paragraphs of prompting. It's also fun reading those, and for each like sentence in it, you think, oh, they had to work around a problem there. Like when it says, output markdown, we really mean it, definitely output markdown, all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, so weirdly, prompting is weirdly transferable. Like, I've heard people who work in AI like research saying it's interesting how this stuff all seems to come together. Like, the different models being trained on different training sets and so forth, their behavior still ends up more or less the same. Maybe because they're all just scraping the same web data, but increasingly these days, they're doing licensing deals. There's all sorts of, like, the secret source of an AI lab is the training data. Associated Press licensed 100 years of, OpenAI licensed 100 years worth of Associated Press journalism. Is that in their training data? I'm pretty sure it is. All of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's weird. The prompting is not as different between the models as I expected. At the same time, if I'm building a feature, that's when I'm iterating really heavily against an individual model. Like, I was building against Claude 3 Haiku a lot because it was the cheapest. I'm considering a GPT-4o Mini is even cheaper as of a few weeks ago. So I've been using GPT-4o Mini for stuff too. And yeah, it's weird. It's definitely a craft. There's also the whole issue of automated evals, like to make sure that you really are being scientific about how you do this. I'm not using those properly yet, and that's my greatest regret as an engineer, is that I haven't got a really good pattern for evals set up. And I'm working towards it. At some point, I'd like to be able to ship features that I know have been evaluated against the latest version of the models. And if a new model comes out, I'll see if it works better. But I'm not quite there yet.
Another random question. You mentioned scraping. Do you have a preferred scraping stack or setup? Is it the usual kind of beautiful soup for, public and Selenium kind of thing for private? Or like, how do you do a lot of that?
I do a lot of scraping. I actually I go straight to Playwright these days, which is so Selenium was first, then there was Puppeteer, which was the team at Google Chrome. Playwright is basically Puppeteer 2, in that a bunch of the engineers who worked on Puppeteer switched from Google to Microsoft and rebuilt Puppeteer. So Playwright is sort of the accumulation of like a whole generation of expertise in this. I love Playwright. It's like Selenium, but they ironed out all of the frustrating pieces. And it's also, Playwright works really well. You can call it from JavaScript, you can call it from Python. I built my own little tool on top of Playwright called Shot Scraper, which is a command line tool for taking screenshots of web pages, but also for running JavaScript against them. So you can say Shot Scraper, URL to a page, and then give it a string of JavaScript, and it will run that in the browser and output the JSON directly to your terminal. So it's basically a command line scraping tool that you can put into a pipeline with a bunch of other things. Love using that. A lot of my scraping as well, I do just in the developer tools console in my browser, because you can open that up on a web page that you're already logged into, run a bunch of document.query selector things to pull data out, and then just copy and paste it out of there. So that's then the other trick I use is Gina.ai have a thing called Gina Reader, where you can say r.jina.ai/URL, and it will take whatever URL you give it, load it up in, I think they're using Puppeteer, pull out just the content and give it back to you as Markdown. So it's a URL that turns anything into Markdown, and Markdown is still the best format for feeding into language models. So you can take any document, get the Markdown out, paste the Markdown into a language model and work with it that way. And yeah, it's kind of fun how scraping is having a little bit of a resurgence now, because anyone who's working with language models wants to scrape data in. If you feed in just the HTML, you get like 2 megabytes of stuff that you don't need. It's a fun time. Also, language models are really good at writing scrapers for you. You can paste in that HTML and say, write me JavaScript that pulls out the titles and the descriptions of all of the news articles, and it'll spit out 4 lines of JavaScript that do what you need.
So I guess as we kind of start to wind down, I'd love to have you riff on how you keep up with everything. The space moves so fast. I talked to some folks who build their own tools. You clearly are doing a little bit of this, it sounds like. Have you built Twitter summarizers, LLM, RSS feed summarizers, that kind of thing? Or is Twitter, what's your go-to news source? Like, how do you think about, staying at the edge?
So the best tip for staying at the edge is to write about this stuff, because I update my blog every day, mostly with AI, LLM related stuff. As a result, people ping me. People send me information all the time, which is great. I do use I'm on Mastodon and Threads and Twitter. Twitter is where the AI community are mostly hanging out still. So I follow a bunch of people there, but also I turn on notifications for specific accounts. So like the OpenAI developers account, the various developer advocates for different models, those I get push notifications on my phone whenever they tweet, which is such a cheap trick. And it works so well. Like if a big new announcement comes out from Google, Gemini, or Anthropic, I hear about it within 3 seconds of the announcement going out. So that helps a lot. I'm in a bunch of private Discords that have various people looking at this from various different angles. So those are great as well. Like the private Discord, there's a WhatsApp group I'm in, but mainly it's mainly Twitter and people knowing that I'm interested in things, which means that they ping me about stuff that's interesting. Like that's a superpower. Honestly, so few people are doing long form blogging about this stuff right now that you can have a major impact on AI just by writing about it somewhere, like just by being one of the few people that will write 4 paragraphs of text about the latest model release, as opposed to just like tweeting about it somewhere.
What are you looking forward to? I'm curious, like your take on the future. It doesn't necessarily need to be crystal ball, but where you think things are going. Like, how do you think about the trajectory?
So I try to avoid the futuristic thinking because it's just so much noise about it. Like any AI discussion where people are like, yeah, well, we'll have AGI next year and none of this will matter. It's like, well, I mean, maybe, but there is so much interest to be had in what's available right now. Like we've got models from like GPT-4 is 1.5 years old. We still don't know what it can do and how to get the most out of that. So my writing and most of my thinking has been focused on just razor focused on what's available right now. What can we start working with? That said, I am very excited about the Claude 3.5 Haiku and Opus models because Sonnet was so good. Like Sonnet 3.5 came along and it was such a like it was the first time since GPT-4 that I felt like there was a really visible difference in quality. Opus is going to be should be a much better model than that. Haiku should be a much cheaper model. So the idea that we could get that sort of like 3.5 sonnet style thing at Haiku prices, that's really exciting to me. OpenAI are clearly going to launch something in a couple of weeks. They've got their Dev Day event coming up. I imagine that will be quite a substantial release of some sort. I've been avoiding all of the rumors because the rumors don't really tell you anything. So I'm professionally interested to see what happens when that comes out. The thing I most want, I don't know if I'm ever going to get, is I need a way to turn the safety filters off on some of these models for journalism, right? Like I need to be able to take video footage of like of like a police brutality incident and feed that into a model for analysis and not have it refuse to answer questions about it. And that's particularly difficult because on the one hand, AI labs love the idea of people doing investigative reporting with their models. Like they're always looking for like positive stories about AI usage. Investigative reporting is a great one. On the flip side, try telling OpenAI that they should give the unfiltered model to journalists who write stories about AI. Like that's the last thing they want is people getting it to spit out a recipe for a Molotov cocktail and then publishing it on the front page of a newspaper. So it's tricky, right? And I'm hoping that that's where the openly licensed models get really interesting. Like a fine tune of Llama with all of the safety filters turned off would be a genuinely useful thing for people who are trying to report on like toxic content on fascist message boards and things like that. So that's something I'm constantly holding out for. And then there's also the most interesting problem in vision for me is you've got a crap table of data from like a PDF and you want to turn that into CSV. And the models are getting closer and closer to being able to do that. Like every time a new vision model comes out, I'll feed it a big, complex scanned document table and see if it can get me the right results. I need to update my knowledge more recently. They're getting so close, and that's going to be transformative. The amount of data about the world that's locked up in crap tables in a PDF file, if we can suck that out and turn that into a SQLite database, that's amazing. And all of my other tooling comes into play.
What's your crap table? Is it something like from a financial document or like
exactly? It's whatever I've seen most recently. Actually, the campaign finance reports are an interesting example of that. Or again, some models ethically refuse to deal with those because they have personally identifiable information in them, which is frustrating because that's what the story is. The story is who donated what money to who. So yeah, there's lots of things like that. Generally, though, I'm just really enjoying watching. I feel like that we're at a point now where the new models that come out are incrementally better than the previous ones, and I love that. You know, I don't have to rethink everything about how I use these tools. It's just like, okay, well, the things that it couldn't quite handle last week, now it can handle. Ethan Mollick suggests anytime an AI fails to do something for you, save that thing in like a notes document somewhere, and then when a new model comes out, try it again, and just use that as your personal benchmark of how these things are improving. I haven't started habitually doing that. It's a great idea. I need to do that.
Well, Simon, thanks so much. It's been a great pleasure. We touched on, I don't know, maybe 10% of the overall things. I've tried to keep it like related to AI. I'd love to dig into Django and and all these other things that I see you writing about that I'm curious about. But hopefully we can do it again sometime and dig into another corner of mutual interest.
That would be awesome. This was really fun. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks so much. Take care.